great event so far. Can't we just end it here? Seriously, everything has been said. And as David said, it's such a privilege to have had students like we've seen today, and then to have them come back and take the time out of very busy schedules. I know they've all got lots of things to do. And to come back and give such thoughtful comments, it's just incredibly overwhelming. And I hope I can get through this, in fact. I've got some formal remarks, and I'm afraid they're probably going to be a little too formal, given what we've heard so far. But let me try to get through them if I can. You know, I was given a paperweight last week, but this is a gift of a whole different order. And I have to thank all of those people who organized at Mayhill and First Rank, and Katya, who I think may have had to...
She had an exam.
She had an exam. And Glenna and Julie, if she's still here, and David Hill and the political science, all my colleagues in Sprees and political science, thank you so much for this. I'm going to say something at the end of my remarks about how a whole generation of people deserve this recognition, but let me develop that point at the end, including Terry Farrell and an awful lot of people who came with me at the end of the 1980s and in the early 1990s. I really want to thank individually all of you who've spoken, but so that I won't lengthen an already pretty long talk, let me talk to you afterwards. I know we'll have a chance later on. I don't feel like I've been teaching that long, but I know it is 38 years in all. And earlier this week, to bring home how old I am, I was going through a folder that was labeled Colgate, which is my first job. And I found these, which you don't see much anymore. These are telegrams. For those of you, particularly in the younger generation, who've never seen a telegram. There's actually a British telegram from the Royal Mail, from the Battersea Division. And it was from Colgate University. And there were 3 of them. The first, call me Colgate University, earliest convenience, then the number. And then prepare half-hour informal presentation on research. And then a week later, after I'd come back from a couple of days in upstate New York, a place I was completely unfamiliar with growing up in Florida, this to offer you our position Soviet politics, called collect. Which again, is probably something the younger people have not even heard about, calling collect. Right, so during the span of my career, emails and apps were replaced by faxes and phones, or replaced faxes and phones, which in turn telegrams and letters. It really is a long time. Wayne, of course, is, what was it, 51, 52 years? 53 years. And I'm at 38, so I just incredible respect and love for you, Wayne. And over this period, over this long period, even teaching itself has changed in important ways, as those of you who've only been around a few years recognize. When I came to Stetson in February of 1989, I was, like most of my colleagues, the classic sage on the stage, who gave formal lectures for an hour and then had discussion maybe for 10 or 15 minutes at the end. And I have to thank the first cohorts of Stetson students that I taught for their patience with me as I made the transition. It was a very difficult transition to a teacher who finally understood what it meant to lead a seminar and to fill a class with sort of TED-like talks for 7 or 8 minutes, interspersed with discussions with students. My most memorable classes at Stetson were in fact those where I lectured least. Text-based courses such as political philosophy and the junior seminar on biographies of the charismatic, where students often surprised me with their fresh insights into the readings. Over the years, I've had Stetson students who have inspired me, like Kendra Koivu, who have amazed me, like Hannah Chapman, and a few who have infuriated me. None of you here, don't worry. mainly people recently because they're checking their cell phones in class. But in many ways, the most rewarding part of my 30 years of teaching at Stetson has been seeing this personal and intellectual transformation of students from their freshman to senior year. Now, there are times when all of us know when you watch senior presentations with your head in your hands. But in most cases, a Stetson education has made a profound difference in the lives of the students. And amid the cacophony of criticism of universities and my own doubts about being part of a system that saddles students with burdensome debt, that fact provides more than a little solace. One illustration of Stetson's own transformation came at the ACES conference 2 years ago, the American Society for whatever it is, East European and Eurasian Affairs, the Slavic conference, the annual one. This was in Chicago. Hannah was there, in fact, in 2017. In back-to-back sessions, I watched 4 of my former students from Stetson either giving presentations, giving academic papers, or asking questions from the audience. Hannah Chapman, Sarah Oates, Patrick Bell, that Wayne will remember, and I think Gary and maybe Bill, and Christine Jacobson was there, right, asking a question. That wouldn't have been thinkable at Stetson 3 decades earlier. Well, you know, I said I think these were my students, but of course they're our students. Students learn from the many voices and subjects that they are exposed to. And so while I'm extremely pleased that everybody has been focusing on me today who's come back, I realize that all of my colleagues were influential, and in fact for many of you perhaps more influential in your lives than I was. But I'm very deeply grateful for all of your comments. Thinking about collective enterprises, I was fortunate to have been part, or have been part, of 2 of the most vibrant and supportive collective enterprises at Stetson, the Political Science Department, and Sprees. Edmund Burke noted that before we can develop public affections, we need to be attached to the subdivision, to love the little platoon that we belong to in society. And these 2 little platoons have been for me the ideal communities in which to experience the highs and lows of teaching and research and governance. It's a measure of the camaraderie in the Political Science Department that in my more than 30 years at Stetson, we only came to blows once, and that's figuratively. And it's really special to have here today virtually the entire complement of the Political Science Department going back to the 1960s with Wayne and Gary, and I saw Bill Hill earlier, I don't know if he's still here, and Ann Hallam I know wanted to come very much, and David Hill. To my Sprees colleagues, thanks to those who came before me, like Paul Steeves and Bruce Bradford and Sergei Zinkovsky at the beginning in the 1950s, and to those who came later, like Michael Dinner, Mihail Fowler, Katya Kudryavtseva, Daniil Zavlunov, and Snezhana Zhotoukhova, we've managed to build one of the best small college Russian and East European programs in the country. It's really impressive. I don't know if people from other areas understand what we have here. But programs like Sprees don't emerge and prosper and survive without the support of administrators. We hate to admit that sometimes as faculty, but it's absolutely true. And we were lucky at Sprees, and Russian Studies as it was called earlier, to have had the backing of Doug Lee and Gary Maris and Grady Ballinger at critical points in the institution's development. It was incredibly exciting and rewarding, and at times exhausting, actually, to be part of the elevation of Russian studies here at Stetson from the late 1980s onward. Those who think that academics aren't entrepreneurs have no idea what it took to bring back 4-year Russian language instruction at Stetson. Try negotiating with Soviet educational bureaucrats in a mammoth institution like Moscow State University, or arranging payment for the first student exchange with that institution in 1989 or 1990. Some of you will, of course, know this story because it's been told frequently, but when we sent that first group, we paid for them with photocopiers that we put on the plane with them as excess baggage in Daytona, that they took off the plane and they had a big van to pick it up because we couldn't send money, and checks and wire transfers weren't possible in those days. Now, at this point, I want to acknowledge for the next few minutes several individuals who shaped my career at critical junctures. The first was John Sheehan, a quirky and charismatic curmudgeon who started teaching me Russian in my junior year in high school. Michael, maybe all Russian language instructors are quirky, charismatic. Sorry. John Sheehan transported me to a different world using the audiolingual method, really unpopular these days, but I actually benefited from it. We did speaking and acting out dialogues in Russian in high school. He insisted on creating a Soviet-style environment in the classroom in 1968. When he entered the class, it was "Ребята, вставайте," students rise. We always had to rise when he came into the class. And when we asked questions, we did it in the style that they did in the Soviet Union. So you were sitting at your desk and you put your hand up like this. And of course, when you're 16 or 17 years old, it's kind of cool, right? It gets you excited about doing something Russian and Soviet. His severity prepared me for Soviet teachers that I would have later, whom I have to thank, I must say, for their tolerance of my at times irreverent and provocative behavior in class. I had read widely in Russian literature before going to Russia to study Russian language, and I'd had a year of Russian poetry as an undergraduate. But while studying Russian in the USSR, I insisted on inserting politics into every possible linguistic exercise. I often did so by aping the expressions that I was seeing every day on the ubiquitous political posters that line the streets of Soviet cities. So when the teacher asked Eugene, use "единый" in a sentence, my typical response was "Партия и народ едины." Well, for those of you who don't know Russian, I was asked to use, I don't know what, united or one in a sentence, and I would say the party and the people are one. Almost everything I had came off political posters. The next person I want to recognize is Peter Solomon from the University of Toronto. In the pre-internet days, it was virtually impossible to do serious research on Soviet politics without going on the official intergovernmental exchange to the USSR known as IREX, which I think you may have heard mentioned earlier. I was exceptionally fortunate to be one of the 6 political scientists who were final stage PhD students or young faculty on the academic year exchange in 1979 and 1980. That wouldn't have happened without Peter Solomon, a specialist in Soviet law from Toronto, who with the very stern Lauren Graham from MIT interviewed me for the IREX fellowship and found something to like in my proposal to study the history of Soviet lawyers. Russian lawyers, actually, as well as Soviet. Peter continued to serve as a mentor after my IREX year in Moscow, and with his support, shortly after getting my PhD, I was able to join a tight-knit interdisciplinary group of historians, lawyers, and political scientists studying Soviet and East European law, a group that met regularly at conferences in North America and Europe. And I think the young scholars in the room will understand how critical it is in your first years to be able to join a group like that. It was a multi-generational group. I was in the youngest group, the youngest cohort at first. The person who was the dean of the group was John Hazard from Columbia Law School, who was an institution. And I was able to work with John, as a person in my late 20s, and John was probably in his 70s. John Hazard studied in Moscow at the law faculty in the mid-1930s and late 1930s during the Stalin Purge trials. So it was a way of having a kind of linkage with an important earlier period in Soviet history. The next person I want to mention is Archie Brown. My first encounter with Archie Brown from Oxford was at the International Political Science Association meeting in Moscow in August of 1979, the first such conference to be held in a communist country. We had just attended a session with the chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, which is like the president of the USSR, in the Kremlin. Now, Putin for years has been meeting with something called the Valdai group, where academics and journalists can ask him questions. But to my knowledge, this was the first time that a Soviet official, a high-ranking Soviet official, had met Western academics in 1979. Archie and I were there together. After the session, we sat on the steps of the Congress of Soviets building and compared notes. One of the revelations from the session, it sounds kind of strange to say it in that way, was that the Politburo met once a week. I believe it was on Tuesdays. You get a sense of the opaqueness of high politics in the Soviet era, that something even as basic as that wasn't known to Soviet specialists. Archie would later host me for a term at St. Anthony's College, Oxford in 1988, the semester before I arrived at Stetson. He invited me to contribute several chapters to his Russian politics reader, to a collection of essays with Lilia Shitsova on Putin's rise to power, and to a special issue of Daedalus in 2016 on post-communist leadership. So he was a real mentor to me. But there's an irony here. My first encounter, although it's kind of an indirect one, was that Archie was my external grader for my MA comprehensive exam. In Britain, you were always graded by someone outside of your university. He had judged me to have written an essay on the politics of Soviet agriculture. He said it was ropey. A term that I really didn't know, I wasn't familiar, and I didn't want to be familiar with that term. It's a pretty negative, it's sort of barely passing. I ended up attacking the question, which was not a wise thing to do, and Archie appropriately gave me, was it Karen who was commenting about getting the B-? Well, this was the equivalent of my B- here in graduate school. The next person I want to talk about briefly is Jerry Huff. Anybody heard of Jerry Huff in this room? Paul Steves, of course, and Wayne, yes. Jerry Huff invited me to join his research group at Duke as I left Bowdoin for Stetson. And membership in that group was another important turning point in my career. Each of us was assigned a particular republic, one of the 15 republics, and as I've said in my book, and some of you will know, I was assigned Kyrgyzia, as it was called, in Kyrgyzstan because I knew where it was on the map, unlike other people in the field. Jerry's workshop made me a Kyrgyzstani specialist, but it also exposed me to regular seminars at Duke with leading Western social scientists like Mansur Olson, and with important figures from Soviet politics and the academic world like Chingiz Aytmatov, who ensured that my first trip to Kyrgyzstan in the middle of 1992 was a charmed one. Now, I invited Jerry, and Wayne will recall this, and I think Gary will, and Paul probably. I invited Jerry to visit Stetson in the fall of 1989 under the auspices of the International Symposium, which is one of the best things about Stetson in my early years here. At that fateful symposium with Jerry Huff was the charge d'affaires of the East German Embassy in Washington and the West German Consul General from Miami. Much to the surprise of everyone, not least the Germans, Jerry predicted that within a short time, Germany would be reunified. It was probably the only time the East and West German representatives agreed on anything, and it was that Jerry Huff was badly mistaken. I want to turn in this section to a discussion of the importance of kind of my place in time, what molded me in the early part of my life. A childhood in Eustis, Florida was an unlikely springboard to a career in Russian politics, to put it mildly. And there were certainly times early in my career when I envied the many professors and graduate students in the field who had family connections with the old country. One of these was Leonard Shapiro, one of my professors at LSE, whose work, The Communist Party of the Soviet Union, was at the time the most important book in our field. So important, in fact, that, and so authoritative, that it was translated into Russian and existed in numbered copies in the Kremlin, so that the elite of the party could read it and no one else. Leonard Shapiro didn't just write about the revolution, the 1917 revolution, he lived through it. He used to tell stories at LSE's famous Tuesday evening seminar on Soviet East European politics about strolls with his nanny along the streets of Petrograd, current day St. Petersburg, during the February and October revolutions of 1917. Well, it was a very long way from 1917 Petrograd to 1950s and 60s Eustis, Florida. But the older I got, the more I recognized that my own background gave me some unusual insights into the political world, even into Russian politics. These were related largely to growing up in a Florida county that was at that time still a part of the South, a region which, like Russia, suffered from an inferiority complex in the face of a more advanced civilization. Just as Russia lagged Western Europe in commerce, technology, and education, so the South occupied a peripheral and inferior position vis-a-vis the North. And at the center of the history of the South and Russia was unfree labor, whose legacies continue to haunt the two regions, even if in somewhat different ways. This sense of backwardness engendered in many Russians and Southerners powerful feelings of resentment and victimization, which have been, of course, readily exploited by political leaders. But while Southerners and Russians thought that they were inferior on a material plane, both groups clung to the reassuring, some might say delusional, belief that they somehow possessed a greater spiritual depth. In Russian, it's the idea of ruskaya dusha, I don't know, is there a word that we can say, Grady, to convey the idea of the depth of the Southern soul? In Russia, you really have that sense. There's this expression. So growing up in Lake County in the 1950s and 60s gave me a sense of the power of political context, of political culture, of unspoken norms and formal practices, and identity politics, whether they're related to race, ethnicity, or region. And these perspectives from my childhood have informed my research and teaching, especially, I should say, my junior seminar on American populism, which I started to teach a few years ago. Now, I first became aware of the possible linkages between Russia and the American South in my senior year at Vanderbilt, when I took a political science seminar entitled "The South as a Modernizing Society" from Lester Salomon, who would go on to do wonderful things at Johns Hopkins and elsewhere. This undergraduate seminar not only gave me a theoretical framework for understanding the similarities of developmentally peripheral region, it also allowed me to do serious political research for the first time. My research for that senior seminar explored the relationship between violence and political economy by examining the variations in lynching rates in Mississippi counties in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What I discovered was that the incidence of lynching was tied directly to the structure of the local economy, with the highest rates of lynching in counties where white and black yeoman farmers were in direct competition, and the lowest rates in counties where wealthy planters still dominated social and economic life. Maybe not a surprising finding, but for me, a very interesting one. It really set me on the path to being a political scientist, because I had majored in history, and I loved history. But I think this is the first time that I was doing serious political science. So this thrill of putting together a causal argument set me on a path to graduate school. Later, as a PhD student at the London School of Economics, I would look up as I entered the main building and see a stone engraving in Latin that reminded us of the purpose of the social sciences. Rerum cognoscere causas, to know the causes of things. That motto has driven me, like it has all of my social science colleagues, but I have to confess that I've been equally concerned with the more mundane enterprise of understanding how things work. So my scholarship and teaching have at times focused more than is fashionable today on the descriptive mechanics of the political world. Put in a different way, I've always wanted to make sure that the ugly little facts of politics match up with the beautiful theories of political science. And most of you know that's taken right from the expression about never let ugly little facts get in the way of a beautiful theory. As I reflect on my scholarly career, a couple of other patterns come into focus. To use a distinction from Greek poetry that was popularized by Isaiah Berlin, I've been a fox and not a hedgehog. The fox knows many things, the hedgehog one big thing. The most successful academics are hedgehogs who redefine a field and make it their own. But my curiosity has pulled me in different directions, and I must say I've been very happy being a fox. Now, if you were less generous, you wouldn't use the term fox, you'd use the term dilettante. But I prefer the term fox. Let's stick with it. If I'm being honest, I also have to recognize that I've had a penchant for the obscure. Not a lot of folks have an academic resume that includes work on Kyrgyzstan, Soviet law, and Russian public administration, subjects that many would say lie on the periphery of communist and post-communist studies. The one notable exception to this was my book on the Russian presidency, which examined the core institution in Russian politics. Except that when I started research on the presidency in the early 1990s, I had the field largely to myself. The focus of the field was elsewhere, as political scientists working on Russia began to shun traditional institutions in favor of subjects like elections and public opinion, which had allowed them to apply quantitative methodology that had come to dominate Western political science, and also to get large grants from SSRC and other granting agencies. And I must say, that really drove our field. I don't know, Joel, if you can recall this, in the early 1990s, there was a lot of money given out. This was a new field. I didn't get a lot of money, but I think I studied a core institution. Well, by the time the field recognized its mistake in ignoring the immensely powerful Russian presidency, which, as I argued in my book, had integrated many of the personnel and practices of the old Communist Party Central Committee, I was on to other topics, including such barn burners as career patterns in the Russian state administration. Of course, the road less taken is often the road that leads nowhere, and this contrarianism has at times gotten me into trouble. Witness my quixotic attempt to stand up to the Apple empire. Instead of buying my wife and daughters an iPod for Christmas when it first came on the market and was all the rage, I chose the iRiver, a pathetic imitation which has ensured that 12 years on, I am still the butt of family jokes. And I remained wedded to the Windows Phone until Microsoft itself disavowed the product. So my penchant for obscurity, at least in the consumer realm, has clearly had its cause. Well, let me finish by noting that a whole generation of faculty colleagues who came in with me at Stetson at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s is due the recognition that I've gotten this evening. That was an era of change at this institution, when an ambitious administration, and I see Gary here in the second row, sought to recruit a new type of Stetson faculty member who could continue the tradition of excellent teaching and close contact with students while adding active scholarship to a life of teaching and service. That transformative moment in Stetson's history resulted in good measure from the decision to reduce the teaching load from 4-4 to 3-3. Still a demanding load, as we all know, but one that at least made it possible for Stetson faculty to make important contributions to the scholarly literature, contributions that they brought back into the classroom. So let me acknowledge the careers of colleagues who have made up this distinctive and distinguished cohort at Stetson, among them Gary Bolding, Luther Krumovich, Terry Farrell, who was here, Terry Whittick, Bill Nyland, and a host of others. At the risk of seeming immodest, I think we helped to remake this institution. And now a new generation of scholars, some of them in the room, Eric Kurlander, Mayhill Fowler, Stephen Smallpage, is in the process of achieving even greater recognition for Stetson. My teaching career is ending at a moment when the landscape of higher education is in flux. There are forces at work, some external, some internal, that threaten to disrupt the very idea of liberal arts-based learning. As we think about what sort of institution Stetson is, it is now and will become, let me conclude by paraphrasing Benjamin Franklin: it's a university if you can keep it. Thank you all very much. It's been overwhelming.